Greetings, range seekers. Welcome to the first in our Pike series, where we are going to be talking everything about the forward fold and the Pike. I recorded the following podcast actually in one take. I've been trying to keep the podcast to about 45 minutes as my sort of target time. And I got into a bit of a flow and ended up doing a 90-minute podcast on the Pike. So I split it into two parts. And really, I've got a lot more to say on the Pike. So there's probably part 3 and 4 coming along later in the season. So other than that, we get part 1 this week and part 2 next week. So check it out and enjoy.
Welcome back, range seekers, and you are listening to the Bendability podcast with me, Emmet, the Splits Wizard. This week we are going to be talking everything about the Pike stretch, also known as the forward fold. We're going to look at all the we're going to give a good description of the position. We're going to talk about the progressions and regressions into it. We're going to look at it in relation to the different relationships to gravity, the 3 vectors theory, for those of you who have attended the workshop. We're going to talk about some of the tests, some of the ways you measure progress in it. We're also going to sort of look at some of the muscles. And then towards the end, I'll give some protocols and some things you mightn't have come across before, or things to try out. So yeah, strap yourselves in as we get to this one. It's going to be hopefully quite dense, so probably grab a pen and paper time. But other than that, before I get into it, a bit of housekeeping. Thank you everyone who left me reviews. I've got a couple of reviews up there now. Thanks so much for the kind words. That's really nice. Everyone who's been sending me messages, emails, everything else, thank you so much. Keep them rolling in as well. It's really good for me because I'm getting requests on topics and people with questions, and it actually really makes my job quite easy, because then I see what things are coming in and I can just rate them and kind of put them in order. So for myself, I kind of have a mini syllabus plan that I'm teaching, or talking about, more really teaching, over the coming sort of first few episodes, where we all get sort of familiar with techniques, familiar with terminology, all these kind of things, and then I'll start delving into bits and pieces and other stuff. But please just keep your stuff rolling in. I haven't decided my format yet. I might address the questions directly, or more than likely I'll kind of group them under topics and kind of answer them in the flow of a podcast. So do listen in for that. Other than that, let's get to it. So the forward fold, or the Pike stretch, it's one of these ones, like, I don't actually know where the name Pike comes from. If anyone actually knows that, please send it to me. But we can imagine it's one of the most basic positions. It's one that comes up the most. It's like people have this idea of, like, I can't bend over and touch my toes, or I can't bend over and tie my shoelaces. And you can imagine, like, from the beginning of history, it would be probably one of the most logical stretches and positions that most people would encounter in a daily activity. They're investigating something on the ground, bending over to play with a child, look at a dog, investigate something, this stuff. Whereas things like bridges and, side splits and stuff like that, maybe they're not as intuitive a position. They're certainly possible, but I'm using the vague terms of anthropology and how I think it would be. I'm open to being wrong in this. Maybe people were doing side splits to side split ISOs to go play with their children. Maybe you should be. So with that, the forward fold, we need a working definition of it. And the forward fold, or the standing Pike, is when we lock the knees or keep them extended, as this is a debatable thing, but we'll have our knee joints fully extended to whatever that could be. With most people, this would be a straight knee. Some people hyperextended, some people are less flexible. This would be slightly bent if we're looking from the side. So there's a bit of degree of variance, like everything we do. So then we would be basically trying to get the head as low to the ground as possible while maintaining the straight leg. So we'd be folding forward. There would be a type of hinging going on, which we'll talk about in a second. And then the head will be going down, and where it gets to, it depends on your flexibility. Now, we need to think of the Pike stretch, and the standing one in particular, is when we're thinking about our planes of gravity and our 3 vectors theory. So gravity can be it can have three functions in a stretch. And the way I think about it, the way we use it to educate the body on how to enter and exit positions and how to train them and how to set up resistance, is we can have our standing forward fold, where this is the center of mass is being pulled towards the earth, hopefully downwards, but obviously there's a bit of an angle, a bit of curvature to it. And this would be along the elongation direction of the spine. At the same time, as you're going forward, gravity is basically pulling your body weight down deeper into the stretch. We have a seated variation of the forward fold, where we're seating now and going forward. Now, the idea we have here is that when we are seated, gravity is basically at 90 degrees to, not exactly, but it's basically at 90 degrees to the bending direction, where if I'm trying to go forward, then gravity would pull center of mass down towards the ground, or a cumulative center, or just the weight of the torso down to the ground. But my lengthening direction, if I'm trying to think, oh, my ground is at 90 degrees, so it's at my feet, my head should be going forward in it. So it's in a plane where it's assisting, but it's not assisting the lengthening direction of the stretch. And this is important for when we start talking about the sit and reach test, which we'll talk about in a second. And then we have the flipped version. We have two flipped versions. One where we are doing a hanging leg raise. It's the simplest way to think about a hanging leg raise. And, we can think about this if I was standing on a box and have my hands going towards the ground past my legs, or going towards the direction of the toe or beyond them. Then in the sit and reach test, we're sitting forward and reaching forward. And then in the hanging leg raise, our arms are above head in shoulder flexion and our legs are going up towards them. In this direction, the weight of the legs is being pulled downwards by gravity. So the compressive element of the stretch maybe not stretch in this position, of the position has to be coming from basically the anterior muscles, the hip flexors, the abs, lats, these kind of things. So, and then we have another position where we're lying on our back and we're pulling the legs down. So this is moving all the other positions. So we have two positions. 1, 2, where the torso is the moving part and the legs are basically essentially fixed. And then we have two other ones where the torso is essentially fixed. It's not exactly. And the legs are moving towards it. So we have two these variations, and we have one where gravity is resisting, and we have one with the legs where the weight of gravity is assistive but not exactly assistive. So we're getting this idea. So when we go down, if we were to talk about an ideal pike with the ideal person with the ideal hip sockets and the ideal flexibility that has been trained to the maximum, we should be able to get this idea where we would go into the stretch, we would go down, and the spine would be curved slightly because it is a flexion position. So think about this, we would have flexion of the whole spine, and it wouldn't be overly flexed, but there will be a small bit. This is kind of important. At the same time, people say, oh, we should be extended in the spine, and that is possible, but if we want to get the maximum depth out of the stretch, we'll be going down. At the same time, we want the feet to be flexed. And this is important because we want to put the whole chain on the stretch. And at the same time, at the other end of the body, the chin should be tucked and the back of the neck should be long. And ideally, if you reach the peak of your flexibility, including dorsiflexion, hamstrings, calves, lower spine, upper spine, neck working like a turtle, I suppose, you should be able to get, maybe not everyone, but a lot of people will be able to get very close to a bilateral head to toe position. This will depend on body mass. It's going to be easier if you're skinnier, and we'll talk about that a bit later. And it will be less harder if you have a bit of a gut. Basically, there's more tissue to compress and there's more things to go around. The other thing in this ideal position is hopefully the legs won't be bent, everything will be fully extended in the lower body, and the head goes down. So we should be ideally aiming for something where even if we had the feet just at 90 degrees, so flat on the ground, that the head could be spaced maybe a fist or two fists from it. Whereas what we tend to see is people go down And then they get a certain degree forwards or a certain degree into the bend, and then they start to bend the head in and curl the upper back like they're doing a crunch. If you imagine they're from the lying on the ground, crunching kind of position, and then they're getting the face to the knees or the face to the shins. This is kind of, it's not wrong, it's one of the stages along the way, but ideally we'd be kind of zippering up the body. So the hips will be tilting over, and they will tilt over, and then the stomach will make contact, and then the stomach makes contact, and the chest makes contact, and the face makes contact. This kind of sequencing. And this would be the same in the standing position and in the seated position, and also in the hanging leg raise and everything else. Now, obviously, doing a hanging leg raise like this, and say even a V-sit position as well, would be also be a display of this. It takes quite a large degree of flexibility. So we just have to bear that in mind, that it takes a lot of flexibility, and even if we are a lot of total range of motion, and even if we are super flexible, if we get completely flat, we could actually straddle the legs slightly. Now, I don't like people to maintain a pike and not a straddle or a pancake position. We're only talking about maybe 45 degrees, enough to kind of get the chest through the legs or get the shoulders through the legs. Obviously, this sort of depends on your biochromial width and how wide your shoulders are. So there is variance anatomically if you're quite wide. For those of you who know Isaac, who's the model in some of the Handstand Factory programs and my assistant coach on M3, he's quite broad across the shoulders, like in proportion to his body. So he'd obviously have to take his legs quite wide. Myself, who's quite narrow around the shoulder, I don't have to take them as wide as he would to get through the legs. So once again, anatomical differences. We are all different people, and people seem to forget this and think there's one perfect form. There's not. There's a general principle towards the position, and that's what we're aiming for. So what we're looking for generally in the M3 methodology is we always go from a gravity assisted plane, so the standing planes, to a gravity neutral plane, to a gravity resistive plane. And this is one of the ways that we go from it. So if we were to take someone and say they had a really good Jefferson curl, a really good standing toe touch, and their toes were going up to their elbows, then we put them in a hanging leg raise, and we find that as they lift up, they get an excessive amount of crunching in the abdominals and the torso compared to where it would be in the standing position. Then we would know that we need to work on the intermediate position, which is the gravity neutral position, to educate the body how to compress correctly in that less resistive angle with more compression and more mental availability for the hip flexors, all these kind of muscles, and being able to underuse the abs at the same time. So you can see that we have this kind of going from assisted by gravity, educate the body on what to do. So when we're in this gravity assisted plane, it's one of these ideas we always have in the system and other stuff, is that if we're working with the nervous system, which we are for most of our flexibility training, either developing strength or educating the coordinative aspects of the body, we use gravity, because if we add gravity or add a little bit of weight, we go in, a bit of resistance, and that pulls us down. That gives directionality to the position we want to go. Then at the same time, if I'm pulling down, I can start to educate the positioning of my pelvic muscles, my hip flexors, and other stuff to actively pull myself down. So this gets into the idea of task orientation, because it can be quite odd, quite hard for a lot of people who, let's just say the pelvis is kind of like an area that can be quite dark to people in terms of being able to sequentially activate muscles and not, or use them correctly at the right time, or as they change function as the hip crosses 90 degrees. So as we do this, we will be introducing a tasking aspect. So what we mean by tasking is we're giving you something to do. In the pike, it's very simple to use contact points. So I would go down and I would touch my toes with my fingertip. And then I go, oh, my fingertip is in contact. Can I reach the hands further, and can I make contact with the knuckles, the palms, the hands, that kind of thing. Or if I'm a bit more flexible, I'm making contact with my toes are in line with my watch. Not that I'm wearing a watch right now, but if I had a watch on that area, can I go beyond the watch? Now, one of the most important concepts in tasking is it has to be achievable. So it's what I term the popcorn experience, where you've all probably had this, where if you're sitting on a couch, you're watching some Netflix or watching a series or reading or whatever you do on a couch. Or maybe you don't own a couch because you're a mover and you just squat. That's okay, you do that too. So you're sitting there and you're sitting in your squat on your couch, your squat couch, and you got some popcorn and you're eating your popcorn and you see you've got an Instagram notification. You're like, shit, someone's liked my post. I have to check them out and make sure it's acceptable that this person likes my post. And your phone, you reach for your phone and it's out of reach. And you go, oh, it's out of reach. And then you retract a bit from it and then you attempt it again. And then suddenly your arm just seems to get longer out of nowhere, reaches the phone or the body coordinates something. It achieves the task and then takes it back. And then you check your messages, oh, I'm so cool on Instagram, I've got loads of likes. Or TikTok, do people still do Instagram? Is it TikTok now? I don't know. Anyway, as you can tell, I'm slowly becoming more and more of a Luddite with technology. And then you reach for the phone. So you've reached for the phone, you've given your body a task, an objective. It has tried one iteration of the task. It has failed. It has now taken the information that I have attempted a task that is achievable. And now I've done one iteration. Now I will try within the bounds of the constraint where I'm sitting on my couch with my popcorn on my chest. And I don't want to spill my popcorn. So that has provided a constraint. That constraint will now limit the options to the body to achieve the task. And then it will go, oh, let's figure this out. And you don't really think, oh, relax supraspinatus, infraspinatus turn on 10% harder, lats turn off, pec minor engage a bit more. We don't think like this. The body just goes, oh, there's something, reach, didn't work, try a different strategy, reach, achieve. Didn't work, try a different strategy, reach, achieve, or iteration is the name of the game. So we can see this either in a static hold, where I'm holding and I'm in a position where I have gravity assisting the stretch or resistance stretching the stretch. We could do this in a different way. So we're using an assistive vector. The assistive vector has provided a direction. I reach in that direction, I achieve the task, and then I go, okay, cool. Can I exceed the task? Okay, so I've gone past my watch, and now I'm going to go for that freckle on my arm or that hair. Okay, I've touched the hair. Can I go a bit deeper? So we're using the task to educate the body in the pike stretch, where we're going, instead of going like, okay, relax piriformis, internally rotate 5 degrees more, shift the hips backwards, etc., etc. But the task is basically setting up this causation change in the body. So this is one of the things that we use a lot. You're going to hear me talk about this a huge amount. And this is how we get around, how we begin to get around and then build the mind-muscle connections in the body by giving you an experience of something, and then the experience happens, the body gets used to the new position and it expands in it. It's the same if we were to use the visual system. We could go, oh, I hold my hand out to the side. Okay, go so far. Okay, I'll look left, I'll look right. I'll try extend my reach, my visual reach. I'll try look further. Okay, I'll look further, and then the arm can go further. So this is how we're accessing the levels of flexibility available to the body to change these ranges. Hope everyone's still following along. So with this vector, assistive vector idea, I can then get deeper and deeper into my position. If we were thinking of a Jefferson curl, this is obviously it's a strengthening exercise, and that definitely plays a large part in our flexibility getting stronger. But at the same time, adding this idea of contact points and touching as we do our Jefferson curl. So each rep, we're doing 5 or 10 reps in a set. We go up, we make contact. The next rep, we go down, we try to exceed our contact point. The next rep, we go up, we go down, we try to exceed that new bound we've set. If we said, oh, I'm just going to try and touch my elbows to my toes and my fingers are a fist or 10 centimeters away from my feet, it's too extreme a task. The body will actually recognize that it can't, I mean, not all circumstances, but in a lot of circumstances, recognize it can't achieve the task. It's impossible with the constraints we've set. And that's when your form will begin to break down. So you'll be the constraint we set of, say, locked knees and straight legs, that will, your body recognize it can't exceed it, so then you will start to bend your knees without noticing, and this kind of thing. So this is when the task has to be achievable. So with that in mind, I'm gonna just talk about the stretch itself. So if we're going into, no, actually I'm going to talk about some more of the vectors, and then we'll talk about the task itself and the Jefferson curl and the entry and exit out of the position. So now let's just say we're doing our Jefferson curl. We do them with 40 kilos, and we're not applying our vector theory or our assistive theory, teaching the muscles to contract and shorten along the front of the body while we're pulling in. Then we can get the problem I affectionately call the movement problem, but it's not exactly that, where you achieve your Jefferson curl and you get, say, well, my toes are going halfway down my forearm, but I'm using 40 kilos of weight, and that is basically pulling me into the stretch. Now when I sit on the floor, while the body has the potential to show this under this loading in the elongation direction, it suddenly has to, the hip flexors and the muscles that tilt the hip and pull you deeper into the stretch suddenly have to find 40 kilos of force in the lengthening direction to help pull you into the stretch. And this is where we tend to not use a huge amount of weight in our stretching positions, or we definitely want to strengthen ranges when we have them, but we want to try and educate the body to be able to enter and exit the position with the least amount of resistance and force added. Now, this will vary position to position and person to person, but the least amount to achieve the goal with the assistance of the shortening side of the joint and the shortening side of the position to achieve it. Then if you think, oh, I've achieved my pike with my toes halfway down my forearm or to my elbows even, and I'm doing it with 5 kilos of added weight, then when I go down and sit on the floor and want to extend in the lengthening direction, I will only need to find 5 kilos of extra force. I'll be using newtons here, but you guys understand what I mean. Need to find that extra 5 kilos in that position, so it's much more achievable versus the 40-50 kilos. And you see this a lot with side splits and side splits training, where I've met some beasts over the years who are like, a couple of people I can think of, where they're doing side split isometrics holding 10, 15, 20 kilos for 30 to 60 second sets. The splits are perfectly flat on the ground, or to the limit that their joint is capable of at the moment, on blocks or on sliders. Very strong people, clearly capable of doing a side split. The availability of it is quite cold, or should be. But at the same time, then when they do a straddle handstand, they have very little abduction of the legs, and it's just not there because they haven't trained the shortening side of the joint. Whereas if we were to train the side splits with less weight but use the glutes and the side butt, as it's affectionately known in some circles, to pull us into that position, then when we transfer to the handstand, there's a bigger transfer from that position where the torso is forcing the legs apart to when the legs are in space, and you have to suddenly find that force. Hope this is making sense. If not, we'll just follow on the rest of the podcast and I will bam this point home again and again. So with this going forward position, we are going forward, and if we can find the going forward and compress effectively, when we go into our hanging leg raise position, then we have more availability to be able to lift the legs, and the muscles are better educated on which way is most effective to tilt the hips, how much the abs have to work, etc., to actually get us compressed. So it's one of these things that if there is a problem in your hanging leg raise, let's say you can do a great pike. So we're doing, we're back to our toes in line with mid forearms pike is a very good benchmark for saying you've got quite a good pike. It's not great, but it's pretty good. If you think about that, I should be able to do a hanging leg raise and basically get my toes to my hands at a minimum, or wrists. But then when I do it and I can press down, actually my mid shins are touching the bar. Then, we have two things going on. One, we probably need to work more on the seated position and educate the body on how to contract and how to drive itself better. It's a software problem as much as a hardware problem. And then, because we've already displayed that we can do this position in one way, and now we just have to figure out how to do it in the gravity resistive direction. So we have that. The key to fixing that is the seated positions, getting really good at the seated positions, either with the active leg lifts, the compressions, or being able to refine the position and use the muscles you have found in your Jefferson curl or your standing pike stretch, and use that to educate the body and then turn them on. Now, this is where things get interesting, because in the hanging leg raise, we also have the exact same idea of tasking. And this is actually one of the first places I met tasking was when I was in Circle Media back in, 2002 or something. And there was one of the girls there who was coming from a gymnastics background, and we're talking about hanging leg raises, and she was talking about how they would teach hanging leg raises in their gymnastic club. So she was a gymnastic coach as well. Their first goal would be to touch the ankles, then touch the toes, and then touch the toes going beneath the bar. And that's the kind of thing they would do. So that was kind of interesting, but we can actually apply this in the tasking idea. So I'm doing my hanging leg raise, and my mid shin is touching the bar. Okay, hopefully you can see it, maybe not, or maybe you'll feel the bar, or maybe you're not getting up there yet, that's fine. And then I go, oh, can I touch my ankle joint to the bar? Can I touch 2 hairs lower? Can I touch that bit of my shin I banged and it's got a bruise and it feels a bit uncomfortable when it makes contact? Great. Can I, if I'm more flexible, I can touch my ankle joint. Can I touch my foot? Can I feel it on the top of my foot? Can I touch my toe? So we can use this iteration process in the more active positions as well. So there's a lot going on, as you see, but we can transfer the tasking via the vector assistance and via the education aspects of the body. The other thing we can do is also a nice one, actually, I was just talking with one of my students about, is you can do the hanging leg raise, and let's say your mid shin is touching the bar, so you're really rounded in the torso and there's a lot of lat involvement. If you add a pause in at the top, you could not quite pause, but try and maintain it there. Pauses are great in this position as well. I think everyone should be able to do 15-20 seconds in a kind of inverted pike. Topic for a different one, but it's a very good display of active flexibility. But you could pause and hold for 5 seconds, and in 5 seconds you're trying to slide your contact point down the bar. This will mean the only way to achieve this will be for the hips to go lower, the torso to lengthen out, to undo the prawning of the torso. So we're curled like a prawn. We try to lower this down and use less abs and find more hips, and that will slowly go down, and then we can repeat the same thing rep to rep. So we've got a few things going on. So that's the kind of idea behind the vectors and the tasking in the pike. The next I'd like to talk about is getting in and out of the position. We're going to just talk about the standing forward fold. So in the standing forward fold, there's a couple of important things that have to happen to reach your maximum depth. And as we go down, so imagine I'm standing and I want to reach my toes. What will happen in a lot of people who are not able to touch their toes is the weight stays centered on the foot. And basically you'll see people will lock up around one of the lumbar hinges. So we've got 3 hinges in the lumbar spine. Then we have the hinge at the hips as well. So you will go down, and we're trying to articulate in. So we're trying to go, keep the hands going straight for the toes. So they'll go basically down. And what happens is, because of the weight of the head and the rest of the torso goes forward, it loads the front of the foot. And the front of the foot loading, if we think about jumping, begins to give us an extension signal. So it turns on the muscles involved in this, in extending the hip, and it makes the hamstrings, the glutes, and the lower back resist more because they want to restore to postural neutral. So the way of going back, and one of the things that is key for this position is, as you're going down and as the center mass is projecting away from the hinge point, we're creating leverage. To reduce this and keep the leverage over the foot, we will shift the hips backwards. And this is one of the things where, like, if you know how to do this and know how to teach people to articulate the spine and also shift the hips backwards, you can get, particularly for people who can't touch the toes, you can get, I've legitimately taught people who couldn't touch the toes that I've never been able to do it, showed them this kind of rolling down, articulating drills with the hip hinge, with the hip traveling backwards, just like a Romanian deadlift. And then at the same time, once they get used to this, once they get used to the actual technique of performing the stretch, it's not even a question of getting longer muscles, it's about technique. They get the technique right and then they can touch the toes. I've even had one extreme case of one person go from probably a mid-shin position, 15-20 centimeters from the ground, all the way to hands flat on the floor. So it's there. And the other thing is, once people learn the technique and get skilled at the technique of doing these positions, then they are able to replicate them immediately the next day. It doesn't rely on building strength, it's building coordination. And this is one of the lacking aspects in flexibility training. No, that's wrong to say. It's not a lacking aspect, it's a lacking aspect in the general fitness culture of flexibility training. Because all this stuff is known about in rhythmic gymnastics, ballet, circus, all basic disciplines that rely on a high degree of flexibility. The coaches, either at the younger age, if they're dealing with younger athletes, will educate them properly how to do the positions, or they'll be able to show, if they know what they're doing, and a lot of them do, will be able to show the correct way to do the position. So it is that, but then in fitness terms, I try to touch my toes, or I don't know what I'm doing, I don't know how to coordinate the body, I don't know to counter shift the hips backwards to maintain the center mass over the base of support, or get it closer in. And this stops me expressing my flexibility. So what we're looking for is, if we're doing a Jefferson curl, we'll talk about doing a Jefferson curl, but you could just do this unweighted, or we'll talk about an unweighted Jefferson curl. So I'm standing on a box, and what I want to do is create a large amount of global flexion in the spine. So I want to try and flex the spine, maybe not massively or as maxed out every single segment of the spine, but I want to create a general curving, just like we're looking for in the bridge, where we have an even curve is the first kind of degree. So this means I will tuck my chin to my chest and open the cervical spine. I will go down, and then for me, because we're thinking Jefferson curl, we're thinking it's a spine exercise as much as anything, the first goal is to prawn the body up and curl it up like a prawn, so we're looking at the belly button. At the same point, this reduces the leverage of the torso, because the torso has gotten shorter by a significant degree. At the same time, we will shift the hips backwards. And this will then, once the bending has traveled all the way down the spine from the top of the skull, the occiput, all the way down, then we're kind of segmentally going. The next thing to go will be the hips will follow. There is this idea, I use it a lot in a lot of positions, is head leads neck, neck leads spine, spine leads hips. We can think about this, just I turn my head, I look at something, the spine is now rotated and the body wants to follow. It's the exact same thing in flexing positions, it's the exact same thing in pancake, which we'll do a whole episode on the pancake as well. And it's one of the things we use. Once you get flexible and have a very good degree of this position, you can just go straight in a hip hinging type manner, but it can be limiting for some people. So this way of articulating in and getting the experience of the position, then we can train it and develop it. Just like in a squat, we want to be able to do a nice unweighted squat with pretty good technique before we start loading it up massively. We can use the squat. I know people would argue, we can use the squat to develop flexibility, and I agree, but it would be better if you had a very good technique on it, wouldn't it? And then you load it up. So, stick with me on this. So once we have reached the point of maximum prawn, the hips will go over. Now, if I was to maintain that maximum prawn, the nose would basically touch the knees if we achieved basically a full degree of hip flexion. But we don't want that. So we want to start straightening the spine out. But at the same time, because we are also trying to use the hip flexors, the abdominals, the muscles along the front of the body, even the pecs will be involved, we will think about lengthening out. Now, one of the classic mistakes here is people extend the cervical spine and start looking, their face starts facing the floor. This is great and all, but the top of the spine, if we think about like We want the top of the spine. We want the spine to be as long as possible in this position. The top of the spine projects a line. If we were to connect the ears across the back of the head, the top of the spine would basically exit there. It's not at the front of the face, and it's not that way. So this would basically mean we want to reach the top of the head like a turtle towards the ground. The top of the head leads the uncurling and the unfolding of the spine from the flex position to a more extended position, and then we'll get down, hopefully. So that kind of gives us what we're aiming for. And then the way of coming back up is the same idea. I will start to pull the hips up, and that kind of like a fishing pole, if we're pulling a big fishing pole or a bamboo stick or something like this, you get the idea that as I pull the weight up, the bend travels back up the spine, the hips will shift backwards. So this is the other thing. As you get more compressed in the pike, the hips will go backwards, and then once the torso or the center of the torso gets closer to the legs, the hips will then move back in over the feet or closer to a more vertical position. So we'll see the legs go from vertical to slightly diagonally towards the heels, and then coming closer to vertical. They won't make a perfect vertical. Well, actually they can as you get more and more flexible. If you get more and more flexible to get the standing head to toe in the bilateral head to toe or very close to it, is you have to lean the hips forward so that the legs will make a diagonal angle towards the toes. This will obviously require a lot of foot strength to counterbalance and squeeze the ground. So it's just like an overbalance correction in a handstand. The toes will have to be gripping the ground. And some people might not be able to get there just based on body proportions. And it's also relying on you basically already being compressed deep into the position. So hopefully everyone's following. And then to restore the position, we will start by hips will go back, spine will curl up more, flex more, and then we will start sequentially pulling up, coming up from our anterior tilt of the hips to a posterior tilt to a more flexed spine, and then articulating the spine up vertebra by vertebra. So this gives you an idea on how to enter and exit the position. This is how we would do it with straight legs. With straight legs, basically we're putting the chain, the whole back of the body under a stretch and trying to maintain it. There is the alternate way of doing the pike where we have the same thing in side splits, we have the same thing in all the positions. We can set the pelvis and spine position, torso position we want, and then extend the limbs out in the direction we want them to go. Or we can have the limbs extended and then try articulate the spine and pelvis on top of them. In the pike entering from a bent leg, what we are trying to do is reduce the loading on hamstring, adductor magnus, calves, all these kind of muscles, and then flex the hip as much as possible. So we're coming over, we're trying to zipper up like I spoke about from the lower abs, from the hips, lower abs, chest, lower floating ribs, chest, down. So we're making a contact point between this and then trying to extend the legs using the quads. This is one of the ways to train the shortening side of the joint, and it's a different method of doing the pike stretch. And it's one of the ones we use it in a lot of the handstand factory programs. We use it in the M3 syllabus a lot. And this way educates the body on which muscles will need to fire and contract harder to maintain the pelvic position as the legs extend. This will be in turn will be the same muscles you will have to pull with to achieve your tasking in the straight leg position. So there's some cross education on this. And at the same time, it gives you a task to achieve where it's like, okay, I have a tactile sensation of where my hip bone is touching on my thigh, where my stomach is in contact, and I want to maintain that contact point. We even go as far as to give people, if you are less flexible and unable to maintain these contact points, putting a yoga block in or a t-shirt. I think Tom Merrick at the moment has a t-shirt pike challenge, which is a good example of this. So check out his YouTube channel or his Instagram. Tom Merrick, the bodyweight warrior. He has this. We will also use this, so piece of paper is also the goal here. Crush the piece of paper. Or you could even do it with a barbell. That's always a bit of fun. Try and keep the barbell in your hips as you extend. It's something to try. This gives you the pelvic and the torso position you need to hopefully, depending on your torso flexibility, because torso does play into our pike as well, because it's a global body position. So then by extending the legs, we will only extend the knees as far as we can go while maintaining all these contact points. And we will be honest with ourselves, and we will video ourselves, and we look from the side and go, oh, where did I break it? And you will always break it much earlier than you think. This will also stretch the hamstring muscles that cross the knees, the bicep femoris and things like this, and popliteus. It will put them under load. At the same time, we will also begin to educate the body on how tibialis assists hip flexion, how my hip flexors might turn off when the sciatic nerve comes under compression. So this is it's a lot. I think I've covered a lot.
So we are going to take a break here. Thank you for listening to part 1 of the pike. Tune in next week for part 2 of the pike, where we go over a lot more things in a lot more depth. Other than that, I have been the splits wizard, Emmet Lewis. You've been listening to the Bendability podcast. If you want to check us out on modernmobility.com, you can check us out there, join our mailing list, find out about opportunities for online training. Check out my other videos on YouTube. Otherwise, as I said, if you want to send me some form checks on the Modern Methods of Mobility Instagram, send them there and I'll reshare them with some critique. Other than that, thank you for tuning in, and I'll see you next week.